The numbers are staggering. More than $27 billion in U.S. farm exports evaporated during the tariff wars with China, with soybeans bearing the brunt. Now Beijing is cementing a long-term pivot, backing Brazil with a $285 million terminal at Santos, capable of funneling over 14 million tons of grain directly to Chinese buyers. For Midwest farmers, silos are full, contracts vanish, and cash flow collapses just as harvest looms. What happens when America's breadbasket becomes collateral damage in a trade war it can't control? For decades, U.S. agriculture was not just a domestic engine, it was a global powerhouse. Soybeans, corn, wheat, and beef flowed steadily from the Midwest to hungry markets abroad, with China emerging as the single most critical buyer. By 2017, America supplied nearly 1/3 of China's soybean imports, a relationship worth tens of billions annually. Farmers in Iowa, Illinois, and Nebraska built their livelihoods on predictable Chinese demand, confident that trade deals anchored by the WTO and bilateral negotiations had created a stable foundation. U.S. exports symbolized reliability. Grain elevators and shipping terminals thrived on the rhythm of trans-Pacific commerce. Yet beneath the apparent stability, cracks had already begun to form. Rising Chinese demand coincided with Brazil's agricultural boom, where cheap land, expanding rail networks, and deep water ports offered a competitive edge. When Washington launched tariffs in 2018, Beijing retaliated by shifting orders south, erasing over $27 billion in American farm exports in just 2 years. The blow to soybeans, over 70% of lost trade, was devastating. Even as tensions eased, memories lingered, and China deepened its partnerships with Brazil. By 2025, the completion of COFCO's massive terminal in Santos, coupled with long-term purchase contracts, signaled that this pivot was permanent. The golden era of American dominance in China's grain markets was over, replaced by a new architecture where Brazil, not the US, was the indispensable partner. In early August 2025, the White House unveiled a sweeping escalation, a 50% tariff on Brazilian imports, built from a 10% reciprocal duty and a 40% emergency surcharge under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. The move followed months of frustration in Washington as Chinese contracts increasingly bypassed the United States, flowing instead to Brazil and Argentina. Administration officials claimed the tariffs would pressure Brazil to play fair, slow China's agricultural pivot, and shield U.S. farmers from foreign undercutting. On paper, the logic seemed simple. If China leaned too heavily on Brazil, then Washington would raise the cost of Brazilian goods entering the American market, striking at one of Brazil's largest export bases. Coffee and beef were placed squarely in the crosshairs, industries worth billions annually. By August 6th, every pound of Brazilian beef and every bag of Brazilian coffee arriving at U.S. ports faced the new 50% tax. But almost immediately, the consequences turned inward. The U.S. Department of Agriculture reported beef prices up 11.3% year over year in July, fueled by tighter cattle supplies and now the tariff squeeze. Coffee imports, roughly 8 million bags per year from Brazil, suddenly became far more expensive, raising costs for diners, coffee shops, and millions of daily drinkers. Food inflation, which had shown signs of stabilizing, ticked higher again. Politically, the tariffs became a double-edged sword. Supporters hailed Trump's toughness, arguing that America had long been too lenient with trading partners who benefited from open markets while undercutting U.S. industries. Critics, however, warned that the policy punished American consumers far more than Brazil. Unlike steel or aluminum, where domestic alternatives existed, U.S. capacity for coffee and beef was limited. The tariffs were not closing gaps, they were widening them, leaving American households to shoulder the bill while China deepened its embrace of Brazil. While Washington tightened its trade net, Beijing and Brasilia were laying down permanent infrastructure to redraw the global food map. At the port of Santos, COFCO, the Chinese state-owned grain giant, was completing Terminal STS-11, a $285 million investment capable of tripling capacity from roughly 4.5 to over 14 million tons annually. Scheduled for trial operations in 2025 and full capacity by 2026, the terminal would handle soybeans, corn, sugar, and soybean meal bound directly for China. For Beijing, it was not just a logistics hub, but a strategic pivot, a steel and concrete guarantee that China's food supply would no longer depend on American goodwill. Trade flows told the story in stark numbers. In 2023, Brazil sold nearly $60 billion in agricultural products to China, with soybeans accounting for the lion's share. That year, China imported nearly 70 to 74 million tons of Brazilian soybeans, over 70% of its total purchases, while U.S. soybeans fell to around 24 million tons, less than a quarter of the market. By mid-2025, Chinese buyers locked in contracts for 8 million tons of Brazilian beans for September and 4 million for October, closing the window for U.S. farmers just as the new harvest approached. Price should have been America's advantage. U.S. soybeans were nearly $40 per ton, cheaper than South American supplies for October delivery. But a 23% retaliatory tariff on U.S. shipments erased the difference, rendering American grain uncompetitive. The result was simple. Contracts that once flowed to Illinois and Iowa were signed in Mato Grosso and Paraná instead. Brazil's government, for its part, responded to Washington's 50% tariffs with outrage, filing complaints at the WTO and threatening countermeasures. Yet in practice, Brazil hardly blinked. Its farmers still had China, the world's largest buyer, standing ready with long-term commitments. The port at Santos and a broader network of railways and deep-water projects in South America meant that every ton rejected in the U.S. could be redirected east. For Brazil, the U.S. tariffs were painful in headlines, but negligible in strategy. For China, the partnership was proof of concept. A resilient food pipeline immune to American pressure. By late summer 2025, the outlines of a stalemate were unmistakable. Washington had escalated tariffs to historic levels, determined to reclaim leverage over both allies and rivals. But instead of weakening Brazil or scaring China back toward U.S. markets, the policies hardened a new reality. China and Brazil were building a parallel system where U.S. farmers were no longer central. In the Midwest, silos brimmed with unsold soybeans. Farmers, who depended on Chinese purchases during the fall marketing season for cash flow, now watched contracts evaporate. The American Soybean Association issued urgent letters to the White House, warning that delayed or canceled Chinese buying could cost billions more. Meanwhile, domestic consumers faced higher food bills as tariffs on Brazilian beef and coffee magnified inflationary pressures. For China and Brazil, the gains were clear: stable contracts, rising exports, and infrastructure tying their futures together. For the U.S., the outcome was murkier. Tariffs might signal toughness, but they did not fill ships with soybeans or restore lost markets. Both sides seemed locked in positions they could not afford to abandon, even as costs mounted. The fracture was no longer temporary. It was structural, a trade war transforming into a permanent redrawing of the global agricultural map. In the American Midwest, the consequences were immediate and brutal. Silos in Iowa and Illinois overflowed with unsold soybeans as Chinese buyers locked in their autumn contracts with Brazil instead. Farmers who had counted on those sales to finance equipment loans and cover harvest costs suddenly faced a liquidity crisis. The American Soybean Association pleaded with Washington to secure purchase commitments in negotiations, warning that billions more in farm income were at risk. Rural communities, already battered by years of volatile prices, felt the sting most acutely. Local banks braced for defaults on operating loans. Equipment dealers saw orders evaporate. For families on tight margins, the difference between selling a crop abroad or watching it rot in storage was the difference between solvency and bankruptcy. Meanwhile, consumers across the country confronted higher prices on daily staples. Beef was up 11.3% year over year, hitting grocery bills and school cafeterias. Coffee chains quietly raised menu prices as Brazilian imports became costlier under the new 50% tariff. What was billed as a strategy to protect American producers looked on the ground like a policy squeezing both ends, farmers losing markets abroad and consumers paying more at home. Impact on Brazil and China. Across the equator, Brazil and China saw their partnership deepen, cushioned from the turbulence. For Brazilian farmers, the surge in Chinese demand provided a powerful buffer against U.S. retaliation. Even as Washington slapped a 50% tariff on Brazilian beef and coffee, Brazil's agricultural backbone, soybeans, remained largely untouched, flowing eastward with unprecedented volume. The Santos terminal, backed by China's COFCO, became a symbol of this new architecture. Its capacity expansion from 4.5 to over 14 million tons annually meant that logistical bottlenecks would no longer cap Brazil's growth. Chinese traders, assured of secure supply, doubled down with long-term contracts that locked U.S. producers out for entire seasons. For China, the strategic win was even clearer. No longer beholden to American grain, Beijing could leverage South America for food security while using trade as a geopolitical tool. The diversification reduced vulnerability to U.S. tariffs, sanctions, or political pressure. For Brazil, the alignment with China promised steady export revenue and infrastructure investment. Together, the two nations effectively rewrote the rules of global agriculture, creating a South-South axis of food security, one that not only absorbed the shock of U.S. tariffs, but turned them into a catalyst for deeper cooperation. The trade war has redrawn fault lines in global agriculture. U.S. farmers face collapsing markets and rising consumer backlash, while Brazil and China secure long-term gains through infrastructure and contracts. What began as tactical tariffs has hardened into a structural shift, reshaping supply chains and political loyalties alike. Neither retreat nor resolution seems within reach, leaving North America caught between pride and pragmatism.